Medieval inns were often the heart of a town or village, offering shelter to travelers, merchants, and anyone on the move. Unlike the romanticized notions of cozy, well-kept establishments seen in modern media, these inns were typically rough, crowded, and far from luxurious. Their primary function was simple: to provide a roof over one's head and a place to rest, but comfort was rarely guaranteed. Inns were usually located along busy trade routes or in market towns, where the constant flow of people made them profitable. The layout of a typical medieval inn was designed for practicality rather than comfort. Upon entering, guests would find themselves in the main hall, which functioned as a communal space. This hall was usually dimly lit, with smoke clinging to the air from an open hearth or fireplace. The walls might be constructed of rough timber or stone, often coated with soot and grime. A few benches and long tables filled the space, where patrons gathered to eat, drink, and converse. In some cases, the floor was little more than packed earth covered with straw or rushes, which absorbed spills, food scraps, and unfortunately, various other messes. The atmosphere within the inn could vary greatly depending on its location and clientele. Inns near bustling markets or cities tended to be livelier, with the chatter of merchants haggling over goods and travelers sharing stories from distant lands. Rural inns, on the other hand, were quieter, frequented by farmers or pilgrims looking for respite. Regardless of the setting, inns were often noisy and chaotic, as they served as both a social hub and a place to sleep. On especially busy nights, the hall would be packed shoulder to shoulder, with little room to move. Musicians or minstrels might perform, their melodies often drowned out by the laughter and shouting of the patrons. Privacy was a rare luxury. There was no distinct separation between dining, drinking, and sleeping areas. Guests would eat their meals in the same room, where others drank or sang bawdy songs. The innkeeper, usually a robust figure with a keen sense of business, would keep a watchful eye on the patrons, ensuring that no one drank beyond their means or caused too much trouble. Inns that catered to nobility or wealthier travelers might have private rooms available at a premium, but most common inns offered communal sleeping arrangements where travelers would pile into one room for the night. Beyond the main hall, some inns had stables where travelers could secure their horses or pack animals. These were equally basic, with little more than hay-lined stalls and a water trough. In some cases, the more desperate or frugal guests would sleep in the stables themselves, wrapped in cloaks or blankets to shield themselves from the cold. Despite the lack of amenities, inns remained indispensable for those on long journeys, offering shelter from the elements and a place to regroup. Food at medieval inns was a practical affair rather than a culinary delight. The primary goal was to fill bellies rather than tantalize taste buds. Meals were hearty but often monotonous, relying heavily on whatever was locally available and in season. A typical meal might include thick, coarse bread, pottage, a kind of vegetable stew, and a portion of salted or dried meat, such as bacon or mutton. Fresh vegetables were uncommon, especially in the winter months, leading to meals that were heavy and often lacking in variety. The quality of the food varied widely. In more prosperous inns, located near towns or cities, the fare might be slightly better, featuring roasted meats or pies filled with game or poultry. However, in rural or less reputable inns, the offerings could be quite dubious. Travelers often complained about poorly cooked food, strange tastes, and even meals that seemed suspiciously recycled from the previous day's leftovers. Food preservation was rudimentary, relying on salting, smoking, or drying, so freshness was never guaranteed. Spoiled food was not uncommon, and eating at an inn could sometimes result in illness. Drink was almost as important as food. Ale was the most common beverage, served weak and in large quantities. Stronger ales were more expensive and reserved for those willing to pay. Wine was available in some inns, especially in regions known for viticulture, but it was typically watered down to stretch the supply. Water was considered unsafe to drink on its own, so mixing it with ale or wine was common practice. In coastal areas or places influenced by trade, Exotic drinks like spiced mead or imported wines might appear, but these were rare treats. Meals were served at set times, and guests were expected to take what they were given without complaint. If the innkeeper offered a stew, it likely simmered in a pot over the fire for days, with ingredients constantly added and removed. This practice made for a robust, if somewhat unpredictable, flavor. Utensils were often scarce, and guests were expected to bring their own knives to cut meat or bread. In some cases, food was eaten directly from communal platters, with little concern for hygiene. The inn's reputation for food could vary widely from one establishment to another. While some inns earned praise for hearty meals and generous portions, others became infamous for serving thin, watery pottage or ale diluted beyond recognition. Complaints were met with indifference, as innkeepers knew that travelers had few other options on the road. Those who could afford better might seek out the homes of local nobles or monasteries, where the food quality was often significantly higher. In addition to the food itself, the act of dining at an inn was a social experience. Eating communally meant sharing space with strangers, listening to stories, and sometimes even haggling over the last bit of meat on a platter. This atmosphere fostered a rough camaraderie, but also heightened tensions, as disputes over food or drink could easily escalate. The innkeeper's ability to maintain order was crucial, as a poorly managed brawl could ruin business and scare away more respectable guests. In essence, medieval inn fare was pragmatic rather than pleasant, providing sustenance in an often unforgiving environment. Travelers ate because they needed energy for the next leg of their journey, not because they looked forward to the taste. Whether savoring a rare, well-cooked roast or enduring a dubious stew, guests knew that eating at an inn was a gamble, one that was sometimes necessary for survival on the road. Medieval inns attracted a diverse and sometimes volatile mix of people, from wealthy merchants carrying valuable wares to humble peasants seeking shelter from the night. The range of patrons was vast. This diversity created a unique social ecosystem, with each group bringing its own set of behaviors, expectations, and dangers. Merchants were a common sight in medieval inns, especially those located along major trade routes or in bustling market towns. They were often the wealthiest guests, carrying gold, silver, and valuable goods. As such, they were prime targets for thieves and bandits, who would sometimes disguise themselves as fellow travelers to get close to unsuspecting merchants. These wealthier guests were typically given better accommodations, such as private rooms or more secure sleeping quarters, in exchange for a higher fee. Despite the risk of theft, merchants also brought news from distant lands, sharing tales of foreign markets, rare goods, and exotic customs. For some innkeepers, hosting a well-connected merchant could prove more profitable than any other guest. On the other end of the social spectrum were the peasants, farmhands, and laborers. These guests were often dirty, tired, and carrying little more than the clothes on their backs. They slept in the main hall alongside other commoners, lying on the floor or on thin, straw-filled mattresses. For them, an inn was a rare luxury, a place to escape the cold, share a meal, and perhaps earn a few coins doing odd jobs for the innkeeper. Peasants were generally viewed as the least desirable guests, as they had little money to spend and often brought lice, fleas, and other pests with them. Pilgrims also frequented inns, especially those located along religious routes such as the Camino de Santiago or the Path to Canterbury. These travelers were often treated with a mix of respect and suspicion. On the one hand, they were considered pious and righteous for undertaking such arduous journeys. On the other hand, some innkeepers saw them as penniless wanderers who would take up space without paying for it. Pilgrims often carried tokens, badges, or relics to prove their devotion, but they were still subject to theft, extortion, or exploitation by unscrupulous innkeepers. Thieves and bandits posed a constant threat in and around medieval inns. Some operated in organized groups, targeting wealthy merchants or nobles traveling with valuable goods. Others worked alone, posing as fellow travelers to gain access to rooms or belongings. Inns were prime hunting grounds for these criminals, especially when the guests were too drunk or too tired to notice their pockets being picked. Some inns even had secret arrangements with thieves, allowing them to operate in exchange for a share of the loot or a cut of the profit. Spies and informants also frequented inns, particularly in times of political unrest or war. Innkeepers, in particular, were valuable sources of information, as they interacted with travelers from all walks of life. Some innkeepers would listen carefully to the conversations of their guests and report any suspicious activity to local authorities or powerful lords. In some cases, the inn itself might be a front for clandestine meetings, where spies exchanged information, forged alliances, or plotted against rivals. Drunkards and rowdy patrons added to the chaotic atmosphere of medieval inns. Alcohol flowed freely, and tempers often flared after a few too many mugs of ale. Fights broke out frequently, especially when money or gambling was involved. The innkeeper and staff had to act as both hosts and bouncers, intervening to prevent brawls from escalating and damaging the premises. In some inns, the reputation for violence was so well known that travelers avoided them altogether, opting to sleep outside in the cold rather than risk getting caught in a drunken melee. Women also played a complicated role in the social fabric of medieval inns. Some were respectable travelers or merchants' wives, but others were prostitutes, serving girls, or women of ill repute seeking shelter. Prostitutes often operated openly in some inns, paying a fee to the innkeeper in exchange for a place to ply their trade. This further complicated the atmosphere, leading to tensions and sometimes outright violence between guests competing for their attention. In this chaotic mix of humanity, it was not uncommon for disputes to erupt over stolen goods, unpaid debts, or perceived insults. The innkeeper, who was responsible for maintaining order, had to be shrewd, cunning, and sometimes ruthless to keep control. Those who could not maintain order quickly gained a bad reputation, which could ruin their business or attract the attention of local authorities. For the discerning traveler, choosing the right inn could be a matter of life or death. Word of mouth was the primary way of learning which inns were safe and which were dens of vice, and some inns became notorious for attracting the worst kinds of guests. For those with money to spare, private accommodations were a safer bet, offering a locked room and perhaps a guard or two to keep watch. But for the vast majority of travelers, mingling with the rough and rowdy crowd in the common hall was a necessary risk, one that could bring new friends, new enemies, or simply another night spent clutching one's belongings and hoping for morning to come swiftly. Inns were not just places to eat and sleep, they were also hotbeds of entertainment and distraction for weary travelers. Given the hardships of medieval life, people craved any form of amusement they could find, and inns provided the perfect setting for a variety of diversions, ranging from music and storytelling to gambling and games of chance. Music was one of the most common forms of entertainment in medieval inns. Minstrels, troubadours, and wandering musicians would travel from inn to inn, performing songs that ranged from bawdy drinking tunes to epic tales of knights and heroes. These performers were usually paid in food, drink, or a few coins, and their presence could significantly boost an inn's reputation. A skilled musician could transform a dreary night into a raucous celebration, drawing more patrons and keeping them drinking well into the night. However, not all musicians were welcome. Some were seen as little more than beggars, using their instruments to distract guests while an accomplice picked their pockets. Storytelling was another popular form of entertainment. In an era without books or widespread literacy, oral storytelling was a primary means of passing down legends, news, and gossip. Travelers would often swap tales of distant lands, encounters with bandits, or eerie ghost stories meant to send shivers down the spine. Skilled storytellers could hold an audience captive with their words, exaggerating details and weaving in dramatic pauses to heighten the suspense. Some innkeepers even hired resident storytellers to keep guests entertained, ensuring they lingered long enough to order more ale or another serving of stew. Gambling was another widespread pastime in medieval inns, though it often led to heated disputes and outright brawls. Dice games were the most common, as they were simple to play and required little equipment. Players would wager whatever they had: coins, personal belongings, or even future promises of labor. Card games also made their way into some inns, though they were less common than dice games. The atmosphere around gambling tables was often tense, with accusations of cheating leading to drawn knives and broken mugs. Some inns employed bouncers or guards to keep the peace, but in more disreputable establishments, the innkeeper might actively encourage the chaos, taking a cut of the winnings in exchange for turning a blind eye to cheating. Drinking games were a staple of many inns, especially on long, cold nights when travelers had little to do but drink and talk. These games ranged from simple contests of strength or endurance to more elaborate challenges involving riddles or dares. The goal was often to get the participants as drunk as possible, leading to scenes of drunken revelry that sometimes spiraled out of control. For innkeepers, such games were a double-edged sword. They kept patrons entertained and drinking, but they also increased the likelihood of fights and property damage. Dancing was another form of entertainment, though it varied greatly depending on the type of inn and the region. In more reputable inns, dances might be organized for wealthier guests, featuring musicians playing lutes, flutes, or drums. These dances could be semi-formal affairs, with men and women pairing up to perform simple, repetitive steps. In rougher establishments, dancing was more impromptu and less structured, with patrons stomping their feet to a lively tune and pulling one another into the fray. Drunken dancing was common, and the line between dance and fight was often thin. Inns also served as informal theaters where plays or puppet shows might be performed. Traveling troupes of actors or puppeteers would occasionally pass through, setting up makeshift stages and charging a small fee for admission. These performances often included moral lessons, bawdy humor, or tales of chivalry and romance. Given the scarcity of other entertainment options, such performances drew sizable crowds, with patrons cramming into the inn's main hall or spilling out into the courtyard to catch a glimpse of the action. However, not all entertainment was lighthearted. Inns were also places where darker forms of amusement took place. Some inns became infamous for hosting illegal fights, where men would square off in brutal, no-rules brawls for the amusement of the crowd. Bets were placed, blood was spilled, and the innkeeper collected a percentage of the wagers. In some cases, these fights involved animals, dogs, cocks, or even bears, brought in to battle each other to the death. These spectacles drew rough crowds and further reinforced the inn's reputation as a dangerous place. Despite the chaos and danger, the entertainment provided by inns was a vital part of medieval life. For many travelers, these moments of distraction were the only escape from the harshness of their daily existence. The laughter, the music, the stories, they were a brief reprieve from the cold, dark world outside. Yet, as much as they provided joy and distraction, they could also lead to trouble. Drunken brawls, gambling debts, and heated arguments over women or wagers often turned a night of merrymaking into a night of violence and bloodshed. In the end, entertainment in medieval inns was a microcosm of medieval society itself, a chaotic, unpredictable blend of revelry and danger, where the line between celebration and conflict was as thin as a knife's edge. While inns offered warmth, food, and company, they were far from the clean and comfortable accommodations modern travelers might expect. Sanitation was a constant issue, and staying at an inn often meant enduring unpleasant odors, uninvited pests, and squalid living conditions. The first indication of an inn's cleanliness, or lack thereof, was often the smell. Inns were typically smoky, dank, and poorly ventilated. The central hearth, responsible for both cooking and heating, filled the air with the acrid scent of burning wood or peat. The lingering aroma of stews and meat pies mingled with the stench of unwashed bodies, wet clothing, and animal dung brought in on travelers' boots. Chamber pots were sometimes emptied too close to the building, and waste from both people and animals could accumulate in the surrounding area, attracting rats and other vermin. Sleeping arrangements were equally unsanitary. Wealthier guests could sometimes afford private rooms, but most travelers slept in communal quarters, packed tightly together on straw mattresses. These mattresses were rarely cleaned or replaced, becoming infested with fleas, lice, and bedbugs. It was not uncommon for guests to wake up itching from bites, or to find rats scurrying across the floor in the middle of the night. Personal space was a luxury few could afford, and a traveler might find themselves lying shoulder to shoulder with strangers of all kinds: merchants, beggars, thieves, and drunks. The bedding itself was often little more than a sack of straw or hay, sometimes covered with a thin, scratchy blanket. In colder months, guests might huddle together for warmth, increasing the risk of spreading disease. Inns were notorious breeding grounds for illness, as travelers from various regions brought with them germs and infections that could spread rapidly in close quarters. Respiratory diseases, skin infections, and stomach ailments were common, and there was little in the way of medical care or sanitation to prevent outbreaks. In some inns, guests had the option to bathe, but this was a rare and often expensive luxury. Bathing facilities, if they existed at all, were usually little more than a wooden tub filled with lukewarm, murky water. Multiple guests might use the same water, one after another, and soap was considered a luxury item. Most travelers simply washed their hands and face, if they washed at all. The general lack of personal hygiene contributed to the overall foul smell of the inn, creating a pungent, suffocating atmosphere that hung heavy in the air. The kitchen area was another source of potential contamination. Food was often prepared in the same room where guests ate and slept, and basic hygiene practices, such as washing hands or properly storing food, were largely non-existent. Meat might be left hanging for days, slowly rotting in the smoky air, while rodents and insects scurried across kitchen surfaces. Drinking water was frequently unsafe, drawn from contaminated wells or rivers, and was often mixed with ale or wine to mask its foul taste. Food poisoning and gastrointestinal illness were common consequences of eating at a poorly maintained inn. Sanitation facilities were primitive at best. Guests relieved themselves in chamber pots, which were sometimes emptied directly into nearby streets or alleys. In some inns, a designated latrine or privy might be located outside the main building, but these were little more than foul-smelling pits with a wooden seat. The lack of proper waste disposal attracted rats, flies, and other pests, further exacerbating the spread of disease. Guests were expected to bring their own cloth or leaves for wiping, and washing hands afterward was not a widespread practice. The common room, where guests all gathered to eat, drink, and socialize, was a hive of activity and filth. Spilled ale and dropped food scraps accumulated on the floor, forming a sticky, rancid mess that was rarely cleaned. Dogs and cats roamed freely, scavenging for leftovers and occasionally fighting over scraps. The floor was often covered with straw, which was meant to absorb spills, but quickly became soiled with mud, food, and animal waste. When the straw became too filthy, it was swept out and replaced, but the underlying dirt and grime remained. Inns that catered to wealthier clients or noble guests were sometimes cleaner, with more attention given to maintaining appearances. These establishments might employ servants to sweep the floors, air out the rooms, and wash the linens. However, even in the best inns, sanitation standards remained primitive by modern standards. Guests might still share beds with strangers, and vermin infestations were almost impossible to prevent. Despite these unsanitary conditions, inns remained a vital part of medieval life, offering shelter, food, and a place to rest during long, perilous journeys. For many travelers, the discomfort and filth were simply a necessary inconvenience, something to be endured in exchange for a warm fire and a roof over their heads. And for innkeepers, maintaining basic sanitation was a constant struggle, one that required balancing limited resources against the demands of a diverse and often unruly clientele. Medieval inns were more than just places to sleep. They were microcosms of the chaotic, unpredictable world outside. Within their smoky, dimly lit walls, people from all walks of life converged, bringing with them stories of distant lands, tales of danger and adventure, and the occasional hidden agenda. From the wealthy merchant counting his coins to the weary peasant seeking shelter, everyone who entered an inn became part of a complex social tapestry, one woven together by the innkeeper's desire to profit and the traveler's desperate need for food, warmth, and protection. But these inns were also places of stark contrasts. While they provided a much-needed respite from the harsh realities of medieval travel, they were also breeding grounds for disease, theft, and violence. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and burning wood. The beds were infested with lice, the food was often stale or rotten, and the constant threat of robbery or assault hung over every interaction. Yet, despite the discomfort and danger, inns remained vital hubs of commerce, gossip, and social life. They served as informal marketplaces, centers of entertainment, and even meeting places for those with darker intentions. In a world without modern conveniences, they offered travelers a rare opportunity to connect with others, share news and stories, and experience fleeting moments of camaraderie before moving on to the next leg of their journey. For the modern viewer, it is easy to romanticize medieval inns as quaint, rustic havens of warmth and hospitality. But the reality was far less charming. Inns were raw, gritty, and often dangerous, a reflection of a world where life was cheap, survival was uncertain, and the line between safety and peril was as thin as a rotting wooden door. And yet, despite all of this, they remained essential to the fabric of medieval life, a testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of those who lived and traveled in those tumultuous times.